Infinity Ward was to have a through line where the father was in the Second World War and then he had a kid, and that was Modern Warfare Price.
Oh, I see.
The father or grandfather? Because that dude is hitting it late mode.
That's true.
Like he's in his
Price has a
20s
kid.
and the 40s, and then he has a kid who's like in his 20s in like the 2010s.
Dude, this guy could be like a
Price, I think, is supposed to be in his 40s, isn't he?
Oh man,
That's what I thought.
I think
I
he's
don't know.
in
I
his-
haven't played that.
I think he's
campaign
30s,
since
but
it came out.
I wasn't
but, I
willing
mean,
to shell
look-
out the $40 or whatever it is still on PS
Yeah.
place or on
Still give
computer.
him $40. Yeah.
Interestingly, they made the multiplayer free, but you had to pay for the campaign, I think, on the PlayStation at least.
No, they made
Something like that.
the Warzone is free. I don't think multiplayer is.
No, I mean multiplayer Modern Warfare 2 remastered. Because they added, I'm
remastered.
certain they added some sort of microtransactions to the game, because they always do. They make way too much money.
If you go, because I actually have Modern Warfare, the 2019 version, and they're just like, I think there's got to be like 200 guns that or more that you can buy like custom, and they're like $5 each. It's just insane. And
Yeah, so
guys
that's
will have
free, but you
all
have to
of them.
pay for the campaign. And the campaign was dope.
Yeah, it was actually pretty good. They got Modern Warfare 2 the second time coming out pretty soon. Apparently it's got some problems, so I feel like it can just add to the skip list. All right, we are live. So it's been a while. We've been on various vacations, so it's been a hot minute.
Speak for yourself. I've been hustling,
Yes.
grinding.
Grinding Call of Duty.
Yeah, I mean, you could refer to those vacations as more of a grind, you know? Get back to the slow life of work.
Yeah, as every backpacker says, I'm not on vacation, man. It's almost like a full-time job. I heard that line a lot. Anyways, this episode we're taking a look at the Ukraine war. So it's obviously been raging since the end of February of 2021 or 2022, and it's kind of come back into the news a bit. And part of the reason is it seems like Russia is not doing nearly as well as people would have expected. Like even myself, I would have thought that they would have just rolled right through, but they've been struggling, and there's quite a few headlines showing that they've lost ground. So we want to take a look at basically what is going on, what is causing the woes of the Russian campaign. And then we also wanted to look at geopolitical issues that might come out from it. Obviously, that's going to be a little bit more speculative, but we'll cover that. And then also propaganda from both sides. We want to take a look at that as well, since there's some pretty funny memes, but also quite a bit of just pure disinformation all over the place. So, all right, I think what we can do is, Price, do you want to kick it off with basically your overview of the Russian campaign and their struggles?
Yeah, I'll just give a fairly brief summary for anybody who hasn't been that into it. I think the initial weeks, we had quite a bit of coverage, and then recently there's been a bit now that things have changed. And I didn't follow it that closely, so it was almost sort of a whiplash in terms of the media coverage when you go from hearing about what the Russians are capturing to, oh, the Ukrainians are holding out, to now they're conquering territory as the Ukrainians. But initially, you could say that the war's roots go back to about 2014, where the Russians occupied Crimea and instigated a civil war in the Donbass region. And that civil war has been raging on and off for 8 years, which I think it can be seen now to have hardened and taught the Ukrainian military a lot of important lessons, because assuming that Ukrainian military was ill-equipped to fight the Russians, almost every official source thought that Russia would conquer Ukraine with relative ease if they decided to go to war with Ukraine. And what actually happened when they went to war with Ukraine was they seemed to make pretty good gains. They had some tremendous gains initially in certain regions that would be among the fastest land grabs ever done by military, which people thought was fairly expected against what they thought was a weak Ukrainian force. But the Ukrainians managed to hold their own and retreat in relative order, and the Russians didn't expect that. So within about 3 or 4 days, even in the areas where the Russians made tremendous gains, they ground to a halt because the Russian logistics could not keep up with them, and the Russian military can only operate for about 4 to 5 days on the supplies that they've got, and then they need resupply. And they basically thought they'd be done in 4 to 5 days because they had such a tremendous ability to advance. And then when they weren't done, they didn't really know what to do. So everything sort of slowed down after about the first week. And that's when the Russians started actually shelling cities. For the first week, they were doing their best, I think, from a balanced perspective, to avoid civilian casualties because they wanted the Ukrainians to just surrender. And then when it turned out the Ukrainians wouldn't surrender and they'd maintain their fighting strength, then they had to start fighting in cities and shelling civilians. So at that point, it turned into pretty much a slog where the Russians tried to encircle Ukrainian units and failed because they had exposed flanks and the Ukrainians were still fighting. And they had about the same number of troops. And for about 3 weeks, that kept up, and the Russians were making slow advances against Kiev and in the southeast. And then after the first month, the Ukrainians started to effectively counterattack, especially in the north around Kiev. And the Russians basically realized that they couldn't conquer those territories because they had relatively equivalent armies to the Ukrainians at that point. So they pulled out of the north, went to the southeast where they were experiencing more success and focused there. And then they spent about 5 months there with very little changing hands. Lots of dead and wounded, obviously. And then in the last couple of weeks, the Ukrainians have actually managed to pull off some good offenses and reclaim quite a bit of territory. And that's basically where we're at in terms of a simple overview of the current war. And the Russian performance has been abysmal by all accounts.
Do you have like details on like abysmal performance? Like, what does that mean in terms of like what was kind of expected or like could have been? What was the potential if they would have done things right, or if they would have performed to expectation versus what actually happened? Like,
so what the Russians definitely were aiming for, looking at just frontline maps and how they moved, was big encirclements like you would see in the Second World War. Armored spearheads punching through and then routing an enemy that's in disarray. And that's where I think the Ukrainians really showed off their resilience, was not falling into that sort of disarray, not getting surrounded, and withdrawing from potential pockets in a lot of situations. And then the Russians just basically figured they'd keep trying that even though it wasn't working and going for more larger encirclements. And it just didn't succeed because the Ukrainians had too many anti-tank launchers and anti-aircraft, and the Russian Air Force never achieved air superiority over Ukraine, which it's a big ask over such a big country, even if you were, say, the Americans. And for the Russians, it's just almost impossible. And they don't have an Air Force that's really designed for ground support. It is really designed to fight another Air Force, which the Ukrainians don't have much of. So it's kind of a null point. And after the failure of the breakthrough tactics, the Russians have basically switched to a more classical First World War style, artillery-focused war of attrition. And they were for about, 5 months there, they were beating the Ukrainians at that. But it seems like with the introduction of longer range artillery by the Americans to the Ukrainians, that they've been able to target ammunition dumps, which has meant that since the Russians have more artillery, they burn through more ammo, and they don't have the ammo to outgun the Ukrainians as hard as they were in the last month because of these long-range missile launchers that the Americans have provided. So that it's quite an interesting development in that I'm sure they still have a large superiority in artillery, but they just don't seem to have the ammunition to keep it going. And they also don't have the technology, interestingly enough. That
So, like it kind of seems like they were gambling on like the first few days or weeks of the campaign, and the fact that they were just like gambling that the Ukrainians would more or less collapse, and then it'd be an easy ride to victory with the breakthroughs, right? Is that what I'm...
Yeah, like if the Ukrainians had been sort of untested or low morale, they should have broken and collapsed based on Russian and Western expectations, because they faced large defeats in terms of landmass lost in the first week of the war. But they kept fighting, and that wasn't within what the Russians expected them to do.
And then Russia didn't get like encirclements or breakthroughs to like completely like encircle and destroy like the army, right? So then,
yeah, the most balanced estimates are that the Russians basically managed to trade sort of a 1-for-1, maybe even a little worse, and that is
in terms of
horrible.
Like, troops, like
in terms of
killed,
troops
right?
and equipment, and like even aircraft. It's in terms of troops killed, it's almost certain that Russia has lost more, which is also terrible for Russia, and because they didn't have enough troops really to begin with for fighting this war. Like they went in with 150 to 200,000 troops, and the Ukrainians had 150 to 200,000 troops. It was very similar numbers, which is not good when you're attacking.
Yeah, one of the analysts that I read his work, he was saying like typically what you would do is you do mass buildup. Like that's one of the reasons that people were some people, even the analysts, were thinking like it wasn't going to happen, like an actual attack wasn't going to happen, because they would expect Russia to use, like build up 400,000 or 500,000 troops on the border and then just punch right through using those tactics.
Well,
like,
I don't know about who those analysts were, but the Russians can't, like, that is their full buildup. Their full army size of non-conscripted troops is about 150 to 200,000 that can be spared, because the Russian constitution doesn't allow conscripts to fight outside of Russia. So they would have to actually suspend that aspect of the constitution to get more people. As far as I understand it, like, it just seems like this was basically their full professional military. Their entire army that could be raised that wasn't conscripts was, and how much good conscripts would do is always questionable.
Yeah, and okay, so that helps, because I mean I followed it a little bit, but not too closely, just because there was so much back and forth, and then it stalled out, and just 5 months of not much happening.
I find most interesting, because I kind of nerd out about the Second World War, and what you run into is that a lot of the stuff is actually decided by artillery. Like, tanks get all the glory, but artillery is the big player, especially on the Western Front. And that's what it's turned into in this war. And getting Western equipment for Ukraine for the artillery duels is incredibly important, because what you do is you get a large radar truck to basically track incoming projectiles. And the Germans have sent some to Ukraine that can track 40 projectiles and give you the location of the artillery that fired those projectiles within 2 minutes. And then you return fire on those artillery batteries. And that's just leagues ahead of whatever the Russians have. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are using basically an app, like an Uber app. But instead of doing deliveries of food, it's shoot your artillery at this position. So then they distribute their artillery as single units all around the place instead of concentrating it, which is the more traditional method. Because when you concentrate it, you can obviously tell everyone to fire in the same spot. But when you're split up, you have to rely on this app for communication. And the thing that's keeping these apps going, apparently, is actually Starlink, which is amazing. It's like Starlink is a lifeline for the Ukrainian forces on the front lines.
Elon saves the day again.
Yeah, it's just an uninterruptible form of communication and unhackable.
I didn't.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
I'd heard like Twitter threads about him offering, but I never knew that it became critical to actually the military. Let alone, yeah, like I thought
Yeah,
it was going to be more of a civilian thing.
it's a big thing with keeping their communications up. I don't know to what extent it's like the backbone, but it's the one that they definitely can't be taken down. Like communication of last resort, I guess, at the very least. You get to the guy who has a Starlink satellite, and then he can talk to anybody.
And
Or
I
the
guess
squad.
the next question, this is kind of almost not worth asking, but did you look at what the likely outcomes are in terms of the nitty gritty war? Like, I think it's hard to make predictions, even if you're looking at like talk.
Yeah, well, like
experts.
you never have like the numbers that you can trust, but it just feels very unlikely that Russia can do anything at this point in terms of like from watching a general overview of the entire war up to this point on like a battalion or brigade level. It seems like the Wagner group, that's their big mercenary group. They've been pretty effective, and obviously their Spetsnaz units have been.
That's the Russian mercenary group?
The Russian mercenary group and the Russian Spetsnaz have been pretty effective, but like their first tank guard brigade, which is like their first tanks are supposed to be the best tank unit. Like they've been losing fights. Like the morale in that army is just very low, as demonstrated by their recent loss of a ton of land to Ukraine. Because Ukraine did what Russia wanted to do in their last offensive, which is make a breakthrough and then rout the Russian army group in that area. And the Russians all fled and they lost 8,000 square kilometers of land. They managed not to get encircled because they all ran away, but they left behind a ton of equipment because they were just running as fast as they could.
Literally.
So does that mean?
Sorry, one thing to interject there is one of the things I saw that the Ukrainians were doing when they would capture Russian soldiers, they would confiscate their cell phones and then call the mothers of the soldier and say like, come get your boy, like, you know, he's in a POW camp, like come get him, just to like, you know, spread like a massive lack of like just to damage morale, right? Because then everybody back home is going to be getting these, you know, if you have thousands of mothers getting these calls, like that is, you know, that's going to spread throughout your society, like knowledge of that, and be quite like just really like that'd be very upsetting and very like demoralizing, I think, from the Russian perspective.
Yeah, well, that's the psyops for sure. The Ukrainians have a lot of help with the psyops because the Americans are in there giving them all the intel and all their knowledge about psyops. Although, but the way the Americans handle psyops, maybe you shouldn't trust whatever they say. Didn't exactly manage to win the hearts and minds in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Yeah, that's true. I just think like if you are the foreign force on somebody else's soil, I think you will always be, for the most part, seen as a problem.
I think the biggest problem is the Russians don't have a reason to fight. Like most of them have cousins or second cousins or uncles, like some sort of fairly close relative that's Ukrainian. Like it's very rare for there to be no connection to Ukraine for a Russian. And then it's like, well, let's go invade this because there's Nazis in charge. It's like, well, my uncle's not a Nazi. Like,
well, that's what you think. You haven't seen his secret room.
Well, you were saying that. So you think like the Russian morale is not great, and that you don't think they can just win. But like, does that mean is that expectation it stalls out now for the foreseeable future, or is there an expectation that the Ukrainian army will make some, you know, consistent steady gains, or like is there like any sort of, or is it still like, is it kind of totally up in the air where they don't, nobody
I'd say
really knows?
Objectively it's up in the air because it's still at the point where like a coin flip event could change things between the Ukrainians managing to make steady gains and them stalling out. But I don't think, like, it's a coin flip between the Ukrainians making steady gains or stalling out versus the Russians. Like, the Russians don't have a coin flip. Their hope is just to stall out the Ukrainians right now.
And they do still hold significant amount of territory from pre-war, right? Like they still have a good chunk of the eastern Ukraine regions that were.
I think it's about 15% of Ukraine's land mass is occupied, and it's all along the eastern border with Russia.
So there doesn't seem to be much hope of Russia ever kind of flipping the script and re-advancing back into the rest of Ukraine.
It just seems so implausible given that Ukrainian morale is obviously higher. The only thing is you don't know the casualty numbers on Ukraine, but if they are anywhere even close to what they're reporting, they're much lower than the Russians, which means that they're getting more experienced soldiers with every week. And then the technology gap is becoming enormous.
Well, because they're like the Ukrainians are getting all their stuff from NATO, right?
Yeah, and they've recently been able to start using drones again that they couldn't use because the Russians had started shooting them down because they got an anti-air defense missile from the Americans that takes out Russian radar trucks that were being used to these radar trucks were used to tell the anti-aircraft where to hit. So then they can start using drone strikes again, because now the anti-aircraft can't target the drones because the radar trucks have been taken out. So the technology gap, like Russia is basically fighting with 80s technology. And a lot of their stuff, a lot of the comparisons I've seen for how they're prosecuting the war is like the Americans fighting the Gulf War, which was 30 years ago.
Yeah, now it is 30, yeah. A good full 30 years ago.
So like in the Gulf War, it took the Americans an hour to launch a day to launch an airstrike once they had a target. And that's about what the Russian Air Force is at. And their technology for identifying targets on the ground for the Russian Air Force is similar to the Americans in the 90s. Like it's a lot of the planes still have to rely on the pilot just looking to see a target unless he's been told where it is. It's like, oh, hit the tank. Well, you have to see the tank with your eyes because you don't have a targeting pod that has an optical sensor that will give you a magnified zoom. It's like, this is insanity.
They just have to Hollywood Top Gun it every time.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of putting it because everyone's seen that moment in Top Gun. But like they have to do that on a good chunk of the time. That's their primary ground attack. Like it's crazy.
They just need a whole fleet of Tom Cruises and
yeah, they're
victory.
Good to go.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because having not looked into it, that seems a bit more positive for the Ukrainians than I would have thought, but not.
Man, the thing that worries me the most about the way the Ukraine war is going is that I genuinely think the Russians aren't far off from viewing tactical nukes as their only way to turn the tide. Like they're just that far on the back foot.
Interestingly, it sounds like this is just what I've seen in a few places, that it sounds like people are thinking it's less likely nuclear weapons are going to be used now than they were at the beginning of the war, which is interesting given that Russia has done so poorly. Seems like the kind of like peak nuclear worries have passed.
Now, why is that? Like from what I've seen, the worries are like higher, but I haven't looked at tons of sources.
It just seems like it. I don't know where it all comes from, but it seems like a lot of like the strategists and analysts that I was following, they were putting like the peak kind of worry in like late spring, early summer, and then since then, it just seems like I think if I was to theorize about why, it's because Russia is so isolated now and so like geopolitically weak that them, like it would be, it would make them even like worse off than they were. Like they just don't have any friends left, and they don't have any like political goodwill or power projection. I think is
I
like
would
the
not
other
say
ones.
that they don't have any friends left, because it seems like, from what I can see in terms of uh, like my research and reading some analysts who work in this field, they like they're while China has been trying to appear neutral, they are trying to form strong ties with Russia and work, because they can get cheap
I mean, I
resources and
guess,
whatnot, and then they can put Russia more and more into their pocket. And there is like a
but it's more of like a, with friends like that, who needs enemies, where China has like, I think that there was the recent summit between Putin and Xi, and basically Putin had to bootlick the entire summit, and Russia got zero concessions from the Chinese. He wanted troops, equipment, technology, various, like, he wanted stuff from the Chinese. The Chinese said no to everything. So if if you want to say friends, I don't think China's a friend. They are a pragmatic supporter potentially, but like
they're an
they don't
exploiter.
give a shit yeah, exactly. They don't give a shit about Russia. They, insofar as like the only reason that they play ball with Russia at all is to use as a tool against the West. And
Yeah,
that's not
that's what I
a,
had seen. So I guess I'll try to revise my statement a little bit more here. Just saying, like, I don't think Russia is completely. I do think you're right in the sense it's like they lack true allies. They might form some.
well, the problem is like I was saying, going back to power projection, like Price giving the rundown of how the Russian military hasn't done well. That's just led to them looking weak on the geopolitical stage. And it's not like China's going to back them up. Like, that's the problem. Like, if China was sending them tech and equipment and troops, yeah, then they might actually be, you could say like China actually matters in that context. But if Russia uses a nuke, I think the logic is like China would even distance themselves even further from Russia.
Yeah,
and
I could see
and
that
like
being the case for sure.
they'd be even more of like just a black sheep and they don't have any aces up their sleeves anymore, in terms of like, people know that they're not as strong as they are, and people also know that China's not going to come in and put troops on the ground for them, and that means they're just not that scary.
The only thing that I could also see it interpreted, though, as if Putin was rebuffed by China, that almost leading him to once again be more likely to use nukes in that situation, because now
he has nothing.
He doesn't want. He'd rather be a worldwide pariah with no allies than be controlled by his one ally, that's China. Like, have to bend to their will, right? Like, if he's not going to get anything from China without doing exactly like bootlicking everything China wants to do, then like maybe he's just going to go completely off the rails. And
I can see that.
A little bit of like, people talk about Putin being crazy, but I think a lot of his stuff is more easily understood by like a real politics sense. Like, he wants to have a sphere of influence, and if he needs to nuke somebody to get it, like, even if it's.
But that's what I think. I think at this point, the Russians are like. I think that's the kind of like the implication, is that nuking right now would basically mean even China wouldn't deal with them. You know what I mean? Like, they would be so untouchable that they would turn into North Korea 2.0. And I think
the sphere of influence is actually zero, because it's like, well, nobody is going to deal with you.
They're a complete puppet of China, right? Like, that's all they are. Like, because I think it would be a much, like, right now, a lot of the kind of totalitarian type countries are more than willing to deal with China or with Russia. Like even India is still buying a lot of oil from them, and will probably continue to do so. So there's a lot of big players that are still willing to tow around with Russia and buy energy from them, and move towards that, like you're saying, sphere of influence, and Russia, they might not get everything they want, but they'll still be able to make a lot of money selling to China, selling to India. If they were to use nukes, I think the logic and implication there would be that they'd be so untouchable that it would be difficult for anyone to do business with them
Yeah, like
and get away with it.
I think that
Yeah, I can see the
makes
logic
sense.
there.
Because
It would just
like, if
be-
you truly like if you
But,
drop a
the only thing
on
I'll-
a Ukrainian city, like I really do think like even if you're like a bit of a despot yourself, I just think like the pressure from the greater, like just even like most countries around the world would be so immense that I think it would just like even some pretty slimy government leaders around the world be like, you know, like this would, you know, if we continue
Well, I think
to
it'd be
support
the
Russia, we're going to
second
be
order
cut off.
backlash.
Yeah, like
It would
you'd just be
be
cut off from everybody.
it would be the second order backlash. It'd be like Russia would be so untouchable once they dropped a nuke that if China bought oil from Russia at that point, all of the Western nations would stop doing business with China.
Yeah, exactly.
They'd say, "Oh, you guys are still like even like have any diplomatic relationships with this country. You're also off the table. Like you're also untouchable." Like that's how untouchable the nuclear option would make them. Would be just like countries couldn't do business with Russia because they'd fear backlash from every other country in the world, also isolating them at that level. And it just wouldn't be worth it. Like, yeah. And I think it's still kind of apparent that if the West walks away from your business, it's not so easy to keep going status quo.
Yeah, I do think if like this is more geopolitical, I guess, but you can see that like with that, I think Russia does have a better chance at like, okay, maybe you just keep the sections that you have and then build out like a sphere of influence in Eurasia and then go from there rather than just pretty much turning yourself into like enemy number one of the world, basically.
Only thing I want to say that I was more confused about and before, I just the reason not to use nuclear that was just laid out makes perfect sense. I was just a bit confused as to how it would have changed much. Like I think that would have probably been the response to using nuclear that would have been forecasted at any point of the Ukrainian war.
And that's probably true.
I think the reason that like in the spring and summer it was like more worried about is because it was like the kind of the disentanglement and like the commitment to getting away from Russia was like lessened, and like Russia had more power projection. So like this, you know, back in the spring, if you remember, Russia was still selling billions and billions of dollars of natural gas to Germany, and Germany was still using it. So I think it was more or less like at that point, Russia still looked more powerful militarily than they were, but they were also still like more important in terms of like the economic situation. Like if they would have used it then, like Germany, I don't think like what would Germany do in April if gas would have been cut to zero? I don't know what they would have done, but it would be a lot worse than now. Like Germany is up to like more or less, I think they're at like 80 or 90% storage capacity, and they've actually gotten some LNG, and like they're not doing good.
Sorry, how did they hit that 90% just from resupply?
Because they went like again, like back in spring and summer, they were buying Russian gas, and they were also buying gas from anywhere else they could, and then they were cutting consumption. There was AC. Well, and this was throughout Europe. Like AC was limited to, I think it was like Spain had like limits on air conditioning at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 80 some degrees Fahrenheit in the office buildings, so you couldn't run your AC pretty much at all. And then there was, I a deal brokered for the winter that they'll cut. Any member state can request a emergency cut of, and then all countries have to cut their consumption by 15%. So there's all this like groundwork being laid during the spring and summer in Europe to be able to like limp through this coming winter without Russian energy products. But they would be in a way worse spot if they would have stopped getting Russian gas in, say, April. Like they would have just been, I don't think it'd be feasible.
Yeah, they would have been completely screwed then.
So I think that's why like the peak of the worry was back then that was when the peak of the reliance, the continued reliance on Russia was still there. And also Russia didn't look as weak, right? Like, so I don't know. Again, that's a good chunk of that speculation on my part, but that seems to be what people are, the logic behind it.
Understandable speculation, though. Yeah, it makes sense. I think like the end result would have been the same, but I can see why people would be more worried about it back then than they are now.
Well, and the last little like explanation there is, I think there was also more of a concern that there would be an unquestioning follow through by Russian military to launch nuclear weapons in the spring and summer if Putin said so. And I think there's a less certainty about that now. I think because that's another thing in Russia that we don't think about as much in the West is like, there's real concern about there being a coup, right, in Russia. And
from what I have researched, all the experts that I listened to said, no, that's not going to happen. Like, it's just, the coup is just off the table completely.
But to be fair, experts on Russia are a little suspect.
Well, I don't know about experts, but the betting odds on Putin, it's only 91% chance that he stays in office by the end of the year.
It's been pretty spicy.
So, but no, I think I don't think there's a high chance of there being a coup, but I think in order to keep that chance minimal, Putin has to do things differently by making sure he doesn't, like he has to play the power game, right? He has to constantly monitor his own internal like power conflicts and stuff, and make sure there's no one gunning for him. Like it's not like it's just a given that every morning he wakes up and he stays in power. He has to actively pursue that. And I think part of that is that part of the reasoning there is that him requesting tactical nuclear launches would put him at risk. And I think he knows that. I think that's the logic that a lot of people are using on the fact that it's less likely now than it was 6 months ago. Is if he said, yes, go ahead and nuke Ukraine, that might put him at risk of
because
that risk is much higher now than it was 6 months ago.
I could definitely see that happening. Like if like I would say that a lot of the elites of Russia, they are dependent on the rest of the world in terms of being able to make any money. And if they are completely confined to Russia and the Russian markets for the rest of their lives and their child's lives, that is, that's going to be a big no-go for them, I would think. And so I could definitely see that being a pretty big factor. And, like if he was going to go through with that, I could see that fomenting quite a bit of resentment towards him and potential overthrow. So that the logic makes sense. Whether or not that's how things are going to play out, who knows? But that does make sense to me.
Well, and I think obviously Putin is operating under a huge cloud of uncertainty, right? He doesn't know. So he doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. So he just has to make decisions. He has to balance those things, right? Like he wants to win the war, conclude the war favorably, but he also he has to like
I think that
his grip.
Like no matter how you slice it, I think the big worry is that now they've went out of their way to declare the conquered parts of Ukraine part of Russia. Like it certainly sets them up that they have the legal authority to use nukes if they're attacked within the Russian constitution. That they can use the nukes for self-defense of Russian territory if the military fails.
Yeah, I mean that is a consideration. Although I'm not sure.
Well, I think the biggest thing is that's like the biggest thing I would assume with that is that it's the play to make Ukraine stop. Like Ukraine, stop. We'll nuke you. Stop. This is our sovereign territory now, according to us, and that means that according to us, we're allowed to nuke you if you attack it.
That I think that's a fair point. It seems like people are considering that less likely, although I guess it could change very rapidly, right? Like something could happen tomorrow where, they start encroaching on these newly declared territories, and then Putin does come out with some speech, and then everyone starts freaking out again.
Well, it's like if you see, I don't know, if Ukraine grabs another 8,000 or 10,000 square kilometers in a week, like then it's just the Russian army is completely collapsing, which honestly doesn't seem entirely far-fetched. Be on the far end of the bell curve, but definitely possible. Like that'd be where you could get something crazy. Like if it's basically they're going to lose not only Ukraine but also Crimea.
Yeah, I think that would probably be a point where nukes definitely on the table, because
Zelensky is still very open about reclaiming Crimea. Interestingly enough, he had the goal of reclaiming Crimea when he was elected. So very much on the forefront of his mind and obviously the minds of the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I do think that would probably, like, if they really do push into Crimea, but they've held that for quite a long time. Like, I don't see that to be. That definitely seems less likely that they're going to be able to push into that, but you never know.
I'm just saying that's like the worst case militarily for Russia is their army just basically routs completely.
Yeah,
and the Ukrainians reclaim all of their territory they've lost since 2014.
Yeah, I think it's a very fluid situation, which is why it's like hard to discuss, because like things could change overnight. I do think it's worth talking about like kind of things that are maybe a bit more certain, although still very up in the air, in terms of the geopolitics, which just like factual implications from a lot of this. I think it's starting with the Russians. It just seems like very bad for them. This was clearly
comprehensive failure,
like a gamble that they lost, because I don't know, like I'd be incredibly interested to hear a rationale of like how this is good in the short or long run for Russia. Like that would be an interesting conversation, because I just don't see any angle that it benefits them.
The only angle is maybe if you're really insistent that they need to get Putin out of there, and they somehow do in the short to medium term, and that's for the best for Russia. Maybe. Seems very unlikely.
Yeah, I think
that's true, but I
dead in office.
I guess what my point would be is like, up to this point, just given the facts that we know and not things that could happen, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Is this good or bad? I don't know. In my estimation, it just seems like bad. Across the board.
The only thing that can happen is that like something is bad enough to change things that lead to a way down the road, lead to a better Russia. But yeah, like everything right now is bad for sure.
Yeah, like my old company severed ties and cut off all of our offices with Russia, and it's like,
Wait,
you
did you
know,
work at McDonald's?
I worked at one of like dozens and dozens and dozens of Western companies that did this exact thing, right? And but like mine, like my industry at the time was, taught pretty high level knowledge work, and tons of the Russian people, they're just bailing. Like I said, as some of like my clients, their like finance team and whatnot was based, like they were Canadian based, but they like their IT and finance team, sometimes chunks of them would actually be in Russia, and like they were just scrambling to extract the people. It's like the brain drain out of Russia must just be brutal. Like I can't imagine. You're just gonna have such a, like, losing all of those smart people would just be like crippling to your economy.
Oh, and even
Well,
their resource sectors feeling the blow because they won't have the people to maintain and operate their extraction equipment, let alone repair it, like a lot of their oil and gas.
Yeah, because those would have been a lot of the time Westerners, right? That they
Yeah,
sent over.
a lot of partnerships, like sort of like what happened in Venezuela, just not to the same degree because Venezuela was purely Western tech.
and it's not just the people; it's actually like component parts, right? Like actual
Yeah, well, it's
maintenance
the
parts.
combo because it's like it's the people who know how to do the repairs and stuff are going to be Western too. It's like,
Yeah, it's both. It's like it's a double whammy. And uh, the other interesting, or just like seemingly horrible implication for Russia is, I think, the demographics on young men. They already had a very just, I guess, fucked up demographic structure, with young men being particularly missing because they have low birth rates, and B, they have a lot of young men dying early from basically diseases of despair, or whatever it's
Yeah.
called.
that's how it was phrased in the best article I've read about it.
Like alcoholism and drug overdose, blah blah blah.
Workplace accidents.
But the amazing thing with Russia is that even countries that drink more than Russia, which is one or two, and countries that smoke more than Russia, which is one or two, and all also in Eastern Europe, they still have life expectancies for their males that are 10 years longer than Russians. Like Russians just have this attitude towards life that's so fatalistic that they just die faster.
Well, yeah,
One of
and
my
you
good
add
friends from college, she's Russian, and her big chunks of her family and friends are obviously still back in Russia. She's from St. Petersburg, and like I asked her, because I remember you sending me that article, and she's like, that is exactly it. Like there is no hope, and so they just, like, she's like, people just die. She's like, it's awful. Like, she knew multiple people, like younger men, who are already dead. Like, it's just like, that's just madness.
well, and then you add, so there's like two obvious huge problems on top of that. Is now you have people dying in war, which is going to be your young male demographic. And then they announced the draft. They announced a partial mobilization or whatever, which to draft military units. And there's some estimates that as many as 300,000 young men have already left Russia. Well, I don't know if it's young men,
Georgia
but men.
and the neighboring countries, right?
Yeah, like I think it was Finland and Georgia were big ones because there's land borders that are
Finland
accessible.
announced that they will be basically banning Russia.
But I mean, they're already
Estonia
gone,
is a
right?
huge one too.
Like, so you have as many people as they were supposed to draft leaving the country. And again, most of those are going to be in the demographic that you were already sorely lacking in. And it's just going to be, it's going to be crazy to see how Russia deals with that.
And then also you have Finland and Sweden joining up with NATO. So they've gone through that process, and they will be signing in pretty soon. Like, they're just going through the ratification. So now it's like you have a NATO country right on Russia's border. Like, that is...
I don't think it can be emphasized enough that a lot of those young men would have close family in Ukraine, that they're not going to stay in Russia to get drafted and go fight. Like,
Yeah, they
that's
don't want to
just
go shoot
not
their
happening.
relatives.
Like, it's just such an insane war. From like, America had plenty of draft dodgers in Vietnam, and you were going over and you were killing people that you had no relation to. This is like a very close to a civil war in terms of relationships between the countries.
Well, and the interesting part is, Putin has spent a good deal of time promoting like Ukraine is Russia, like it's little Russia. We are greater Russia, and the Ukraine is a part of Russia, and that's why we have to take them. Like that's why it has to become a part of the actual Russian, like the proper Russian legal borders. And so you're pumping out that propaganda, and then you're saying, okay, but wait, you're going to have to go shoot these people or hit them with artillery. It's like, yeah, I can't imagine any scenario as me being like a Russian young man and saying, yeah, that seems reasonable. I want to go do that. Like maybe if you bought into the propaganda of them being Nazis, but you'd probably be seeing like a decent chunk of like pretty shitty video, like truly bad, gruesome videos coming out. It's like, man, I would like to get rid of the Nazis if I bought into that propaganda, right? But I want to get rid of the Nazis, but I don't want to do it by just shooting the regular troops. Like, it doesn't seem like a great way to go about this. So, do you have any more things kind of like on the the concrete geopolitical? I know we kind of deviated from that a little bit, but some more concrete things in terms of like just the scenario like that Russia is facing and the implications that like we do know. Is there anything else that you guys want to add to that?
Well, I guess just like beyond Russia, I think it's just you can mention a few other. Obviously, Ukraine, they lose. It's just like they're the biggest losers out of all of them.
Yeah.
They just all their infrastructure destroyed, people dying for no reason. It's just
everybody's
generally
living in like no power.
it's just an awful
disaster.
situation for the average Ukrainian. But beyond that, then I would say like European Union, they like right now not good for them. Obviously, like if you just look at what happens in the Germany with energy prices, and you look at what's happening in, I guess it's not the EU anymore, but UK, inflation out of control, currency collapsing because they can't keep up with the US because they have high energy prices, so their inflation is out of control, and they have no levers to pull. So, like in the short term, for sure, the European Union is a big loser. I think you can come up with some what if scenarios where in the long run it's actually good for them. I think the what if scenarios for them being good are much more reality based than the Russian version, or much more probable than the Russian version, I guess you could say.
There's some pretty bad long-term what ifs too. Like for instance, if the war goes on for quite a while, or if they just never go back to buying Russian natural gas, it's going to put a lot of pressure on energy intensive businesses to close up shop and move to other continents.
Yeah, like there's definitely some long range or long run bad scenarios too, or at least like mixed results.
Like Germany is like one of the economic powerhouses of the world, and one of the big reasons for that was their cheap energy from Russia. So it was kind of a deal with the devil that they were partaking in, and now they've got to figure out how to live in a post-Russian cheap Russian gas world, and see what that does to their economy and their competitiveness in the international manufacturing space.
Yeah, they're one of the biggest manufacturing hubs in the world.
So I think that covers the EU to a degree, and then like the US is just like I would say clear winner. I don't really see any way you can put them as anything other than a winner. I mean, they secure, I guess, the European Union as a just like direct ally, and also like get Russia out of the European Union, or get Russian influence out of the European Union, which is just good for the US because the US is the only game in town left, pretty much. And then on top of that, the US has a lot of energy resources that they can export, including LNG. So they just have a ready-made huge market for their energy products that make them a lot of money, and then also give them political influence in Europe, right? Like like I guess you can make the case that it's much better to be reliant on the U.S. than the Russians, but it's not like the U.S. will be probably, it's not like the U.S. would be above using that reliance to extract political favors and whatnot. So, which is again, I don't see how that's anything but a positive for the U.S. having that bargaining chip and having that export market and having that increased influence.
Yeah. And I think Canada's kind of in the same boat as the US, just a little bit smaller. The one interesting thing with Canada being that a lot of the raw resources, especially other than energy, but all obviously including energy, but fertilizer and timber and minerals, coal, all of those sort of things are produced by Canada that Russia's was producing and selling to Europe. So there's a lot of room for Canada to edge in on the Russian sales into Europe as well.
However, it doesn't seem like our current government is willing to, at least for
They're
energy,
laying
go
the
for that.
groundwork to admit they were wrong about everything. They're saying how Canada should be helping out Europe's energy crisis. It's like, well, we can't because you blocked our LNG projects and our pipelines to the east, to the Atlantic. But I mean, if you're saying we should be helping, I mean, maybe they're laying the groundwork that will unblock some stuff. Maybe.
Yeah, Canada is like the U.S. light in that respect. I mean, I don't think Canada will be able to use its political muscles.
Yeah, it won't be big enough to do leverage, but like we'll make some good money.
Yeah, Canada. I think Canada will make some good coin for sure. I guess the other one that we did already kind of touch on, but to like wrap up, is China, because like China, I think you can make a case it does benefit clearly from having Russia kind of dependent on them, and they've already done this where they've already negotiated favorable conditions to like for commercial transactions and stuff. So they can buy energy for cheap. They can buy other natural resources for cheap, basically, because the West isn't buying it anymore. And they also they also have Russia on their kind of side in a lot of issues now. Like they'll just be able to bully Russia into siding with them on pretty much anything they want, because Russia won't have any other markets to sell to, really. Go ahead.
Oh, another interesting one in Asia is India, because India's always kind of been like they've intentionally been playing the middle ground between the East and the West in the Cold War, or like the Russians and the Americans. But they're really sort of lining themselves to be up in the same sort of position that the EU was in before this, where they get tons of cheap Russian energy, but they keep like the US on the hook for, oh yeah, like just sell us some fighter planes so we don't have to buy Russian ones, right? Like they can play both sides and they can get the best of both worlds if they do it right.
Yeah, I think India could definitely benefit. India is probably less likely to face the downside that China's facing, which is like just enhanced scrutiny on any sort of reliance on totalitarian, regimes or whatever. Everyone in the Western world waking up to the fact that, oh, maybe it's not the best idea to have, critical strategic resources, primarily coming from places that you have very little political alignment with. And obviously the number one country that comes to mind for pretty much every Western country is China as being a problem, right? So I think that's where it's like China could potentially lose out from this to a degree, because I think you already see a huge attitude shift and already like real policy shift in the US to extricate themselves from the China dependence. Like all sorts of they've like the US has already banned a lot of sales of like critical high tech components like computer chips and stuff like that to China now. This is all in the last few months, and that's probably going to accelerate. And obviously there's like counter tariffs and counter measures, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, like China was just like in a much better place when the status quo was just like free trade and very little scrutiny. The less scrutiny there was on all this business activity and trade secrets being stolen, blah blah blah, like the better it was for China. China was like hugely benefiting, and now like that scrutiny has gone up. It's just a huge, I would say, net negative for them. Whereas India is not in the same. I don't think they're going to get the same level of scrutiny. I don't think when people hear India, I don't think they go, "Oh, well, that's a huge strategic threat to us." Like they're more or less a democracy, I guess, and more or less aligned with the West.
Changing there, but
well, I think at this current moment, like the perception of India is much more positive than of China, and most people would probably not put them on the same level, right? Like they're viewed very differently. So I don't think India is going to get the same scrutiny. Yet they do benefit in a lot of the same ways that China is in terms of cheap energy and having basically a cheap natural resource piggy bank in Russia. So
yeah, I think the big thing, just to reiterate what you're saying, is there's like a tone shift where complaining about the reliance and funding of autocracies used to be conservative, if not downright reactionary in politics, and it's absolutely mainstream middle ground now. Like liberals and conservatives can agree that it's not a good thing to effectively fund autocracies without thinking about it. The Germans even used to think that the more you traded with China, the more democratic they would get.
I mean, to be fair, that was like the entire West's attitude on why they should liberalize in China in the first place. So it was not like Germany was the only ones.
They're just the ones that I'd heard it from most recently. But yeah, it wasn't exclusive by any means.
Yeah, so I think that covers like most of the geopolitics and the implications. I don't know if we want to do a quick jump into like the propaganda stuff, or
yeah, I think that's well worth it.
I think just a quick overview on some of the propaganda aspects would be good.
Do you want me to start? I guess.
Yeah, I think you did the most research into that, so.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure how to structure it, but I guess just going through kind of the events of what led up to the invasion is interesting, because that's where a lot of like, I guess, propaganda started. It's interesting that so basically Zelensky, and everyone's favorite
actor turned
president, everyone's favorite country leader in this day and age. Like the whole reason he's in power was that the US got mad that the elected president of Ukraine did like a pivot away from the EU, because the Ukrainians were basically going to take the first steps into being integrated into the European Economic Zone. And at the last minute, the president U-turned, said no, and went towards Russia. And like Russia had like some sort of similar organization it's like the Euro-Asian economic zone or some shit, some basically EU copycat, but for their former Soviet satellites and other
The EU
countries.
at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically.
Scuffed EU. Very, very scuffed EU. Anyway, it pissed off a bunch of pro-Western citizens, and there was like protests and riots and stuff. And the US stuck their nose in, and they eventually managed to get the parliament to oust the president. And they did it unconstitutionally, is the big problem. And then, of course, a bunch of Western politicians were like, oh no, it was all kosher. It was all done constitutionally, definitely democratically done, all fine, but it was easily verifiable that it was not, and it was unconstitutional. So that's kind of like where, like, I mean, you can go back before that, but that like this kind of round of propaganda, that's where it started, was the West basically saying, oh, this coup was actually just a democratic process. Don't worry about it. So, whatever you think about that is what happened. And then, obviously, Putin, in the lead up to the invasion, went with like the denazification propaganda, which would be laughable if there wasn't like some kernels of truth, which is just like the unfortunate thing that in the whole Ukrainian situation is like there's just so many instances, like fuck ups, I guess, on the West part, that it's easy for Putin to throw like what would otherwise be completely crazy conspiracies out as propaganda, and because there's some like kernels of truth, it actually works very well. And like the crazy thing would be like, oh well, the president is Zelensky, he's a Jew, like how could it be a Nazi regime? But then you dig into it deeper, and there is like actually avowed white supremacist and neo-Nazi affiliated politicians and other groups in positions of power in the Ukrainian government. So, which doesn't look good.
I can deep dive the history of the Nazi relationship too, because I was interested in that when I first heard about it. And it basically goes all the way back to the Russian Revolution, where Ukraine was independent for all of a hot minute before the communists decided, no, you're jumping into this USSR thing we've got going on by force. So the Ukraine had maybe a year or two of its independence before it was conquered by Russia again. And then they were starved. Basically, the USSR didn't exchange its foreign currency, so they traded barter economy on an international scale, and one of their big bartering chips is wheat. So they needed a certain quota of wheat from Ukraine, and when they went to get the wheat, they took the wheat, and the Ukrainians starved if there wasn't enough excess wheat. So they all started starving to death. Also, in that vein, they took an excessive amount of wheat because they wanted to reduce the strength of the farmers there. They really didn't like the Ukrainian farmers.
That was the Holodomor, right?
Yeah, so that was like 6 to 8 million Ukrainians starved to death, and like the Russian army taking wheat from the fields at gunpoint so you couldn't steal any. Like crazy, absolutely crazy,
yeah, and
horrible.
if you went to harvest, like if you were a starving farmer and you went out into the field after they had taken all the grain, and you even found a single grain, like a single kernel of grain, and you did not return that to the repository immediately, you were shot. It's fucking wild.
Obviously, when the Nazis rolled in, they were treated as liberators because now finally those Russians are gone. Then the Nazis basically just turned around and did exactly the same thing because they weren't going to starve and the harvests were poor. So they just stole all the grain they could from Ukraine while they occupied it. But in the interim, when they first saw the Nazis, they figured they could work with them to liberate Ukraine and make a free country. And then some of them continued working with the Nazis. Some of them realized how bad the Nazis were almost immediately. But the most famous rebel leader continued working with the Nazis for the next 2 years and then turned against the Nazis and the Russians. And then they continued fighting against the Russians into the 50s. So the Russians always qualified them as being fascists or Nazis because of the fact that they worked with the Nazis for a brief period of time. And there's still those groups that venerate that Ukrainian independence, a partisan fighter tradition. So I think, like from a Western perspective, they'd be most similar to something like the IRA, but they have that affiliation with the Nazis at one point in their past, which is always brought up. And then some of them are just genuinely inspired by Nazi ideology, which is another aspect of the grain of truth where they're like, oh yeah, that they had the right idea about, this whole racial heritage thing. It's just the Ukrainians are also part of the master race. That's the big deal.
Is that a part
It's
of
like,
are those the ones associated with Slava Ukraini or Ukrainia?
well, that's the problem is Slava Ukraine is just glory to Ukraine. And that was the motto of most of those resistance fighters, but it was definitely included the ones that were genuine Nazis. But it's like this historical through line of independence fighters that were far right, and often they worked with the Nazis during that period in time the Nazis were in there. And then some of them adopted the racial ideology and still exist today.
And now Christina Freeland throws her support in with them.
Oh yeah, 100%. Canadian Deputy Prime Minister, neo-Nazi, Christina Freeland.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good coverage of that, because again, like that is the kernel of truth that Putin latched onto. And then I think this is just like organically, naturally happened was the right wing in the United States, and I guess maybe the West more generally, as a I guess the far right, you'd call it, or whatever. As far as I can understand it, the far right does genuinely support Putin as kind of like a fuck you to the establishment. It's there is Putin does talk a lot, and I think Putin intentionally speaks to a lot of these elements in his speeches and stuff in the West, just to like kind of get this sentiment going, to create discontent and discord.
Yeah, exactly.
But Putin does have a lot of like traditional value, talk a lot about traditional values, and acts like traditional policies like anti-LGBT stuff and other kind of like like classical kind of like fundamentalist Christian type ideas. And then he obviously is doing stuff that is like in direct opposition to like centrist Western politicians, right? So if you're like a kind of out on the extremes person in the West, that it actually might speak to you, right? Like this guy talks about traditional values, and then he also is shitting on people that you also hate, right? Like these centrist politician types. And I also have seen in like kind of the more further left, kind of extreme left political spheres, a lot of the same pro-Putin sentiments and anti-Ukraine for the similar reasons, although they're obviously not as drawn in by the traditional values. A lot of the time they link it back to like Russia's Soviet past and their communism. And then they also just see like
literally the horseshoe.
Yeah,
that seems so wild to me, but I don't ever interact with the people on the far left on the internet.
So there is like actual like far left communist tanky types,
right? Price?
Oh yeah,
clearly.
I'm in there deep with the boys,
Yeah, so I think it is kind of interesting that it's I would say it's essentially like you're anti-establishment, anti-centrist kind of extreme political groups both see enemy of my enemy situation in Putin, and have tended to voice support for him. And then that also just it's funny enough because that also just feeds back into, I would say, mainstream Western propaganda, where mainstream media uses that as a tool to like smear any questioning of, say, the policy or the steps that have led up to the Ukrainian situation, or any criticism of mainstream government decision making and stuff. It's like, oh well, maybe the West shouldn't have been as aggressive in pushing NATO westward towards
and
Russia,
violating the promises that they made to Russia at the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's like, oh, if you say that, it's like, oh, what are you, like a far right Nazi, or like?
I mean, just to clarify though, I've seen the context about the quote unquote promise not to move NATO east, and in context, it's not a promise not to move NATO east. It's taken out of context when people try to quote that.
Yeah, I guess.
Just speaking to it specifically, there's a big thing with the Berlin conference or whatever it was.
But I think there's been a lot of valid criticism of how the West has handled the NATO, or how West has handled NATO, how the West has handled the European Union, and just the Ukrainian situation in general. There was also, like, you can see a lot of parallels with what happened in Georgia, and just like, it didn't work for Georgia, obviously. Yeah. And again, like, it comes back to, well, Putin may be a dickhead, but at the same time, it's the Ukrainian people that are suffering because you played political brinksmanship recklessly, blah, blah, blah. And again, all that's to be brought back to the kind of propaganda angle, where I think those are valid criticisms that should be, brought up by journalists and the like, but they're dismissed as, just, oh, you're either a Russian agent or you're a far right extremist, white nationalist or whatever that just likes Putin because he speaks to your neo-Nazi tendencies. And it is interesting how kind of the feedback loop of propaganda has worked in this situation.
I think another interesting thing with the right-wing connection to Putin that hasn't been as emphasized as much as I would have expected. I guess it doesn't play well from either side to really push it, but in Russia itself, the big push that Putin has made is for the Orthodox Church, like to work basically in alliance with the Orthodox Church, much in the way that the Russian Empire worked very closely with the Orthodox Church to control the plebes. So they've brought back military medals that are handed out by the Orthodox Church. And apparently Putin's closest advisor, at least this is according to some guy who wrote a biography of Putin, so I'm assuming he knows a thing or two. He spends time in Russia, but he said Putin's closest advisor right now is the Russian Orthodox mystic, and they're always talking about, like, mysticism.
Rasputin.
Yeah, basically, really, like Putin is really genuinely into the sort of Russian mysticism, which
that's only ever worked out for Russian leaders, is getting a mystic from the middle of Siberia. Only
like he's going full czar mode, and you don't see that much in like the Western discussions of Putin, or even like Putin portraying it himself.
Like, actually, Jordan Peterson had somebody on, and he talked about like the religious like aspect to it, where it's like a lot of this war is, it's like a lot of the Russian, like Putin himself and the Russian elites, they see themselves, like they see Russia as like the inheritor of the Holy Roman Empire, and they must,
Well, the Holy Roman Empire? I think you mean the Roman Empire.
No,
everyone knows Russia is the third Rome.
Yeah, I guess.
No, it actually is. Like, the Roman Empire was,
You don't play enough EU4 there,
Yeah, I
Con.
don't. I absolutely
Ryan's right. The Holy Roman Empire was a German / Italian collection of principalities that persisted throughout the medieval era. The Roman Empire, second Rome was the Byzantines, and then third Rome, which is that's what the Russians claimed.
Yeah, the Byzantines sold the title to Spain, so Spain claims they're the third Rome, but the actual royal family of Byzantium married into the Russian royal family, so they claim the title of third Rome.
Okay,
Well, and the religious
we're gonna have
connection
to-
was through the Byzantines were Orthodox, and the
Yeah.
Russians are Orthodox,
Yeah,
so that there was the religious
Let's-
continuity which runs through it.
Got to make sure we don't go off the rails into an EU4 discussion.
I'm just saying, like, Putin's gonna genetically modify himself with some Romanov genes, and then they'll be right back in it. Like,
History repeating itself. That's actually, I didn't know about the mystic. That's I don't know if that's disheartening or heartening.
Well, I might increase the chances of nukes.
It's just that's wild. Yeah, that's a weird
That
one.
was something that I had actually seen as well before. I didn't
Yeah,
know that
like
it was like his most trusted advisor, but like I knew that he was one of the guys he was conferring with was like a heavily religious, like heavily
Does
into
the
the
US
religious figure, into the religious aspect of things, and that was like a big motivator for him.
Does the US have any intel on schlong size of this mystic? What does the schlong look like?
Then we'll know if it's Rasputin
Reincarnate.
Yeah. All right. Anything more on the propaganda side? I think there's. I know that Hubbard's had done some research into the Hunter Biden stuff, and just like that.
I think we can leave that to the side. Like that's a whole can of worms. I do think
it might be a little bit much.
Again, just to briefly mention it, like there is again kernels of truth about Hunter Biden this is just like documented fact, he was on a board for a Ukrainian energy company where he was paid a salary of upwards of $50,000 a month. And he did have emails with top executives where he was basically influence peddling. And this was obviously all post 2014. And he was essentially selling a connection to his dad, who was then vice president. And then Joe Biden pressured government officials into firing a prosecutor who was investigating the company. So it's like there's just these clear cases of corruption and just shitty behavior that, that the U.S. in this case, but other Western governments do engage in. And it just gives like easy fodder for Russians to be like, well, like what the hell's going on here? Like, this is not above board. Like,
well, the same thing goes in the opposite direction as well, where obviously there was a ton of cases of corruption for pro-Russians. Like even the fact that the president that was democratically elected and then undemocratically couped flipped sides from the EU to Russia means it was almost certain that at some point he was getting a better shake from Russia rather than Ukraine necessarily getting a better shake from Russia. Like, there's
an asymmetry there for sure, where I don't think many Russians expect their government to be above board, and also a lot of government officials. I don't think there's the same moral grandstanding and high horsing in Russian circles.
I'm just saying from the American propaganda side, where they're saying how everyone was bought and paid for by to some extent, they were saying everyone was bought and paid for by the Russians. To the bigger extent, nobody cared about Ukraine until the war. But that works. But I think the asymmetry is like the Americans and other, Western governments always say, well, we'd never do that. Like, oh, look at all this corruption that we've never partake in. And then the Russians go, oh, yeah.
except for this, this, and this, and this, and this. And I think that's where it's just like it's just easy wins for the Russians because they're not getting held to the same moral standard, and they're also not doing the same level of moral grandstanding in most cases. They don't look like as big a colossal hypocrites, right? Like when
that's true.
It's just like it's much easier to, like, if you're going to talk a big game about how above board and democratic and like
Honest
these
you
are
yeah.
and that's supposed to be like the Western value set, right? And then you violate it on the regular, and you can be proved to violate it on the regular. It's just more undermining of your position than if you don't claim those things. Like Putin, I don't speak Russian, I don't follow his speeches, but I don't think he's probably as big on the moral grandstanding about anti-corruption and the like. So I just think that's the whole Hunter Biden thing. The fact that that even exists is just kind of surreal in my opinion. Like that there's this war, and then there's just like layers and layers of shit that you can dig into for endlessly.
I just want to say, to like sum up what I was trying to say, I think is that like the reason Ukraine was the most corrupt country in Europe was because obviously both America and Russia were trying to exercise their soft power to get it to do what they wanted it to do. And so there's just billions of dollars floating in for influencing people, which it's a pretty insane state of affairs where you just have two of the larger powers in the world. And I mean, America's obviously the largest, just jockeying over you. It's a small country.
Constantly, undermining your institutions for their own gain doesn't help your country run
properly.
Well, corruption free.
If if you have a takeover of the government, basically unconstitutional, using unconstitutional means, as the case was with the Ukraine, it's like, how are you going to, like, you don't have a lot of options to go from there in terms of trying to build your nation into a less corrupt state, because the
best story to illustrate that, I think it was Zelensky, but it might have been the president before him. They brought in a stipulation that you had to declare your assets in the government, and then some people just lied on their declaration, and the Supreme Court of Ukraine declared that there could be no punishment for lying on your declaration of assets. But you did have to declare your assets. You just wouldn't be punished for lying about them.
I declare I have one Dogecoin.
Yeah, it's like, that's just the most corrupt story I've ever heard of a government.
Yeah. So I think, I don't know, unless you guys have more to add on the propaganda front, I was just thinking we could wrap it up with just kind of a few thoughts on like what it means if you're just a regular person like us following it along. Because I don't know, for me at least, it's kind of hard to make the connection with like, why should I give a shit about any of this? Because
I think we can move to that.
I guess for me, the reason, like, after looking into it a bit more and thinking about it, I think it's not. I think this is one of the instances where you could go on your merry way and not really pay much attention to this story if you're not, directly affected. Like, you're not Ukrainian or Russian. As sad as that sounds, just sad as that is to say, it just, I think it's true.
How much energy do you have to devote to this? Probably not a lot.
Yeah, and it's like, I think there's a problem with people feeling like they need to have an opinion on everything.
Yeah,
you really don't. Like, if you just have no interest in geopolitics and military conflict, and you just want to sit around the water cooler and say, I literally don't know a single goddamn thing about Ukraine and Russia, that's probably a lot better than...
Yeah, and I'm not going to comment about it. I'm not going to throw out my opinion because of that.
Yeah, that's way better than you reading one New York Times article or one whatever article and saying, yeah, like, oh, well, my opinion is like, I have a super strong opinion about this conflict after reading a couple articles. It's like, I don't know, after researching it for a while, I still don't have a strong opinion about anything because very complicated, it seems, and very fluid and whatever. But it's the one thing I would say about like for regular people, there's a couple things like, Western governments are spending a shitload of money on supporting Ukraine. So it might be it might be one of the things you look into about like, it's your tax dollars paying for it. Is it something that you agree with, right?
Yeah.
So if again, you can only look into a limited number of things in your life, but if it's like, it does impact you because you do pay taxes, and it's like, if your government is shuffling billions of dollars out the door, it might be worth looking into what it's going to.
One thing I would also add to that is, a lot of the special interest groups with something like this, like they're going to make a ton of money, and they might not want the gravy train to stop, right? Like all of the arms manufacturers, those types of companies, right? Like Raytheon and all of that. So it is something where, they're likely to milk this as hard as they can. And again, it will be you paying for it as a taxpayer, because that money's got to come from somewhere. And so I do think it is something to, like, at least at the voting booth, it's something to think about. But I have to agree with you, Hubbard. It's, if you don't have the time and energy, I think it is completely valid to just say, I don't know. And I'm not like, I'm just not going to have an opinion on this. And that's just how it is, because I don't feel like after researching as much as I have, I still, I really do. It's like, man, I don't like, I probably know a lot more than the average person now, but it's still like, I don't know anything.
But I'd say it's almost like an obligation to not have an opinion, you should try to not have an opinion on stuff like this. If it's something you just like don't have the care or energy to like look into deeply, then don't form an opinion, or try not to form an opinion, or a strong one. Like if you do have an opinion, like hold it with a 1 out of 10 and be like, okay, well, this is my placeholder 1 out of 10 opinion. I haven't really looked into it. I can just leave it off to the side because it's not important to me. And I guess the other in thing, like for people, is like also not getting caught up in like the propaganda and the propaganda spirals. Like, just because, organization you disagree with most of the time, or you think is corrupt, is pushing one side of an issue, doesn't mean the other side of the issue is right. Like that's like what I've noticed with a lot of these things is like, oh, well, like the New York Times is, not nearly as reliable as it used to be. And it, like, a lot of the time it pushes, kind of Democrat liberal propaganda. Okay, that's true. Like it's been compromised in terms of its bias and independence. But just because the New York Times has a perspective on something doesn't mean the opposite is now automatically true. Like just because they say, oh, Putin's a bad guy, doesn't mean like, oh, actually, New York Times said Putin is a bad guy. Putin must be like the savior. He's going to, team up with Trump and take back the White House in 2 weeks, right? Like it's you don't need to pick the other side of the issue because some group or some politician or some newspaper took the other side. Like there's just no need to get caught up in the propaganda. And, I would say like get taken in by, say, Russian disinformation, like there in this case, like, or the other side of it, right? Like you can just sometimes
just because Putin said one thing doesn't mean that the opposite's going to be necessarily the truth.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one of the things that I noticed from this quite clearly is both sides are full of shit, and it's pretty hard to untangle the mess, like to untangle the web of BS. So I think it's best to approach both sides with a critical eye, and like Hubbard said, not get swept up into it.
Well, I could agree with both of you because I probably would, but I'll take it further to a different sort of aspect and say what I feel like I've learned through this. And I couldn't have learned it unless I was interested in the conflict. And that is just the sheer dominance of bots on the internet. Because when this war broke out and you went anywhere on the internet that was text based, you were probably seeing 80 to 90% of comments and posts being made by bots. Like just completely inhuman. Like you really know it's a bot when it's perfect English grammar, because nobody speaks with perfect English grammar on the internet, especially on a lot of message boards that talk about stuff like this. And it's amazing. And the fact of the matter is it's almost all American bots, so that they like to run both sides of the story, because obviously you can't just go out there and spread one side of the propaganda, or you'll get reflexively a growth on the other side. But it just rendered discussion through text on the internet ineffective, if not useless. And then what I did find interesting was that you can still find good analysis done by people on YouTube, because you actually have to have a face and a voice, and like that stuff can't be botted yet, but it will be. But we're not quite there yet. And it was kind of a revelation just as to how quickly the internet can go from interesting and usable to useless on a topic based on the interest of the powers that be to throw their bots at it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess that just brings up the I'd say increasing necessity to find like people you trust yourself, and then like stick to those people to a degree, because
especially like real people, like someone with a YouTube channel or podcast, or like something that bots can't do, like as opposed to just like, a community of faceless people that you don't actually know.
Well, that's what I mean. Or like, yeah, real journalists, like people with like a Substack that you trust, that have like, you know, regular newsletters, or YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you know, like people that you know exist in the real world that write a Substack that you can, yeah, like they're a real person, verifiable, real people that you can follow, that you trust. I think that's getting increasingly.
I think the worst case scenario is if you end up on like a text-based, like an image board or a Reddit, and like a community you trust, and then that gets flooded with bots. And if you didn't realize that, it could just totally make you give you a totally wrong perspective on everything.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Like I agree with you. I think you need like actual individuals that provide you news sources, like you are subscribed to them on YouTube, or you follow them on Substack, or wherever you find them, like people that are actually, they run their own blog, that are actually their own individuals. And you know, if they don't have a comment section, probably for the better.
True. But yeah, it's just like, I don't know, this is the first time for me that I've ever really noticed that in the text-based internet world, that it was just like, what the hell is going on? Yeah, it's like, it's like, you get a sense like the uncanny valley, right? It's like, it's almost like humans are talking about this, but not quite.
Yeah, just give it a few more years. Now you're not going to know. You won't know the difference.
Like they're going to get better at, like right now they're too good. Like they're not quite bad enough.
They haven't trained them on the YouTube comments yet.
Yeah.
I really need to feed them a few billion YouTube comments, and then they'll get the right feel.
Yeah, exactly. YouTube comments, like, it's got to be just hell on earth.
Depends on the channel, but yeah, regularly.
Yeah, but it depends on the channel, but it inversely correlated with size. The bigger it is, the worse it is.
Yeah, that's also true. All right, do you guys have anything else that you'd like to add?
I think that's about it for me.
Yeah, I talk too much.
All right.
Peace.